It was just after 2 in the morning when the quiet street on the south side of Birmingham, Alabama, broke apart with the sound of fists pounding on wood. The night was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes even silence feel thick. A few streetlights flickered, casting weak orange halos on the cracked pavement. Most of the neighborhood slept in darkness, their curtains drawn, their air conditioners humming against the heat. But inside one small, weather-worn brick house, a woman named Tasha Williams stirred from sleep, her heart already racing before she was even fully awake. She heard the pounding again, louder this time. A man's voice followed it, sharp and commanding. "Police, open the door!" It wasn't the kind of voice that invited questions. It demanded fear, and for a moment Tasha froze in her seat. She looked at the glowing red numbers of her alarm clock, 2:04 a.m. Nothing good ever happened at that hour. Her dog, Milo, started barking from the living room, his nails clicking against the floor as he darted toward the front door. Tasha threw the covers off and hurried after him, her mind still struggling to make sense of what was happening. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was 32, lived alone, and worked as a field agent for the Bureau, though lately she'd been on medical leave after an injury in the line of duty. The job had been her whole identity for years, but lately all she'd had was time and silence. She learned how loud silence could be. She pulled her robe around her and glanced through the peephole. All she saw were dark shapes, at least 3 of them, standing close to the door, flashlights slicing through the air. One beam hit her window. Her stomach turned cold. "What is this?" she whispered to herself, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. Outside, the officers were tense. They'd received a call about a possible drug operation linked to the address. The tip had come in anonymously, and it was enough for them to act. In their world, a few minutes, hesitation could mean danger, so they didn't hesitate. The pounding grew violent, shaking the frame of the door. "Police, open up, this is your last warning." Tasha barely had time to shout back before the crash came. The door splintered inward under the weight of the battering ram. Wood shards were scattered across the floor. Milo barked wildly, and she stumbled backward, her phone falling from her hand. The room filled with the blinding glare of flashlights and the echo of boots on hardwood. "Hands where we can see them," someone shouted. Her breath caught in her throat. She raised her hands instinctively, her voice breaking as she tried to speak. Wait, what's happening?" But they didn't answer right away. The officers moved with precision, clearing each room with their guns drawn, shouting commands over one another. The chaos was controlled, mechanical, something that looked like authority but felt like invasion. Tasha stood frozen in the hallway, heart slamming against her ribs. Then one of the beams of light swept over the wall to her right and stopped. There, hanging neatly above a small desk, was her navy blue FBI field jacket. The bold yellow letters gleamed in the flashlight's glare. FBI. For a few seconds, no one moved. The shouting stopped. The tension in the air changed, sharpness melting into confusion. One of the officers lowered his weapon first, glancing at the others. "Hold up," he muttered. Another officer stepped closer, his face tight with disbelief. "You see that?" Tasha's voice was shaking, but her words came out steady enough. "You've got the wrong house." The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had, the kind of silence that carries guilt in it. One of the men pulled off his helmet, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, are you?" "Yes," she cut in. "I'm Agent Tasha Williams, Bureau Field Operations, badge number 4476. She was breathing hard now, her eyes wide with both anger and fear. "You just kicked down a federal agent's door." Outside, the flashing red and blue lights still painted the street in chaos. Neighbors peeked through blinds and cracked windows, watching the spectacle unfold. The night that had been so still just minutes before now carried the weight of something that couldn't be undone. Tasha stood barefoot amid the debris of her broken doorway, the hem of her robe brushing against splinters. The officers shifted uneasily, their authority collapsing under the realization of what they had just done. One of them murmured into his radio, his voice low and nervous. But underneath that confusion, something else simmered, something that had been there long before this night. Tasha could feel it in the way they looked at her. The disbelief, the hesitation, the way one of them had said "ma'am" like it was hard for him to swallow. Because before they saw the jacket, they didn't see an agent. They saw a black woman in a small house on a quiet street, and for some reason, that had been enough to break her door down. Her hands dropped slowly, her breathing uneven. She looked at each of them in turn, her eyes burning not from fear anymore, but something deeper. Betrayal. "Do you even know why you're here?" she asked quietly. No one answered her. The night settled again, thick and heavy, but it wasn't quiet anymore. There was a weight in the air, a kind of understanding that no one wanted to admit. Somewhere down the block, a porch light flicked on. A curtain shifted, and the world that had seemed normal just an hour ago now felt cracked open. Something ugly had slipped through. Tasha didn't yet know that this night would make headlines across the country, that people would argue over it, divide over it, and turn her life into a symbol of something much bigger than herself. For now, she just stood there, half awake, half shaking, staring at the jacket on the wall, the symbol of everything she had worked for, the thing that was supposed to protect her. And for the first time, it didn't. After that night, nothing in Tasha Williams's world went back to normal. The front door was replaced the next morning, but the damage was deeper than broken wood. It lived under her skin, in the quiet moments, in the way she started checking the locks twice before bed. Every sound in the dark made her heart twitch. The uniformed apology that came from the department 2 days later didn't fix anything. It was half-hearted, almost procedural, the kind that comes when people want a mistake to disappear fast. It was an unfortunate mix-up, they said. A false report, a data error. But for Tasha, it wasn't a mix-up. It was a violation. Her neighbors whispered about it for days. Some said the cops wouldn't have done that if she'd been anyone else. Others said she must have done something to deserve it. The local news ran her story for a single night, and then it vanished under a new headline. But inside her small house, the unease grew into something sharper. The walls felt smaller. The silence is louder. She started noticing a dark car parked across the street late at night. Sometimes it was there for hours, engine off, lights dim. When she looked too long, it would drive away. The first time she called it in, the dispatcher told her it was probably a coincidence. The second time, no one even came, so she stopped reporting it. But she wrote down the plate number on a piece of paper and tucked it in her desk drawer anyway. Her suspension from the bureau had stretched longer than she expected. The injury from her last mission had healed months ago, but the higher-ups hadn't cleared her for field work yet. Some said it was protocol. Others hinted that her involvement in an internal misconduct investigation the year before had made her a target of quiet retaliation. Bureau politics were complicated, loyalty mattered more than truth, and Tasha had chosen truth. That had never sat well with everyone. When her supervisor, Agent Keller, called her one afternoon, she could already hear the tension in his voice. "Tasha, I've done what I can," he said, "but you're on thin ice. The department's looking for a reason to make an example out of someone. Keep your head down." She wanted to laugh. "They kicked my door in, Keller. How much lower can my head go?" He didn't answer right away. "You know how this works," he finally said. "You make too much noise and you'll find yourself out of a job." Then he hung up. For the first time in her career, Tasha felt powerless. She had spent her life believing that justice was a system that could be trusted, that if you worked hard, followed the rules, you'd be protected by the same laws you enforced. But now she was realizing something uglier. Justice had cracks, and through those cracks, people like her slipped quietly away. The local police department never visited again, but one of the officers from that night, Officer Graham, started showing up in unexpected places. She saw him at the grocery store once, standing near the exit, pretending to scroll on his phone. Another time, he drove past her house slow enough that she caught his eye in the mirror. She didn't know if it was guilt, curiosity, or something else, but it made her skin crawl. When she confronted him outside the store one evening, his face stayed calm. "You're imagining things," he said with a faint smirk. "It's a small town, people cross paths." "Not like this," she replied. "You've been following me." He shrugged. "If I wanted to follow you, Agent Williams, you wouldn't notice." His tone was playful, but his eyes weren't. That night, she sat in her car for nearly an hour before going inside. Every time she looked in the rearview mirror, she half expected to see him there. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was survival. The bureau finally called her back to work 2 weeks later, but it wasn't the same. Some of her coworkers avoided eye contact, others whispered when she passed. Her reputation had shifted from respected to controversial. "That's the one whose house got raided," she overheard one agent say. "Probably had it coming." The hostility wasn't just social, it was strategic. Files she needed disappeared from the system. Requests for backup took longer to approve. Her field reports were questioned, rewritten, and returned with red ink. It was as if the institution she once trusted was slowly turning her into an outsider. Then came the new partner, Special Agent David Rains, charming, confident, and just a bit too smooth. He'd transferred from D.C. after working on a high-profile corruption case, and from the start he seemed to know too much about Tasha's situation. "Rough year, huh?" he said during their first assignment together, flashing a sympathetic grin. "I read your file, you've been through hell." She didn't respond. She learned not to trust kindness too easily, especially when it came from someone who benefited from knowing her weaknesses. But Rains had a way of breaking through walls. He was attentive, funny, and made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in months. Late nights working cases turned into late-night conversations. What started as a professional partnership began to blur into something personal. Still, something about him didn't sit right. He always asked questions that didn't feel casual, about her house, her finances, the investigation she had blown the whistle on a year earlier. When she pressed him about why he transferred, he said he needed a change of pace. But his eyes darted too quickly when he said it. The truth began to creep in slowly. Rains wasn't just assigned to her. He was sent because of her. The Bureau was quietly reopening her internal case, and Rains was their inside man. She found the proof in an email that wasn't meant for her, his name listed next to a line that read, "Assess ongoing risk, monitor contact." That night she didn't sleep. The sense of betrayal hit deeper than she expected. It wasn't just about work anymore, it was personal. Her days grew shorter, her patience thinner. She snapped at colleagues, started skipping meals, and ignored calls. Every face at work felt like a mask. Every conversation is a test. The isolation pressed in, making her feel like she was back in that dark house again, waiting for the door to break. Then came another strange event. One morning she found a thin envelope taped to her door. Inside was a photo of her standing in her kitchen, taken from outside her window. On the back, in small block letters, it read, "You're not untouchable." She froze. Her first instinct was to report it, but to whom? The local police had humiliated her. The Bureau was using her. She was running out of people to trust. Days later, Rains showed up at her doorstep unannounced. He claimed he was checking in because she'd missed a meeting. But as she watched him lean casually against her doorway, something in his smile felt too deliberate. "You look tired," he said softly. "Maybe you should take another break, some time off." Her eyes narrowed. "Is that your idea or Keller?" He didn't answer. He just smiled again, as if he knew something she didn't. That night she started digging, old case files, archived records, her own reports, and she found something. The same address that the police claimed to have raided by mistake. It wasn't random. It had appeared in a Bureau operation log 6 months earlier, tied to a confidential informant connected to one of Rains's former cases. The address was listed next to her name. Someone inside had fed that address to local law enforcement. Someone had wanted her door kicked in. When she confronted Rains the next day, he didn't deny it. "You weren't supposed to be home," he said quietly. "You were a message, Tasha. You stepped on the wrong toes. They just wanted you to back down." Her voice broke, "And you helped them." He sighed, guilt flickering across his face. "I didn't want it to go that far, but this isn't a game you win by being right. You should have kept quiet." Something inside her cracked then. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was disbelief, the kind that strips away what little faith you have left in justice. The next few weeks became a blur of paranoia and planning. Tasha started documenting everything, emails, photos, and recordings. She met with an old contact from Internal Affairs, someone she once trusted, and told him she had proof of internal corruption. But a week later, that contact was found dead in a supposed car accident. By then, Tasha knew she was next. The walls were closing in, but she refused to be silent anymore. She began reaching out to a journalist, preparing to leak everything she knew, every detail, every name. But before she could make the final move, the same dark car appeared outside her house again. It sat there for hours, engine running, lights off. She stood by her window, her phone in one hand, the other clutching the edge of her jacket, the same one that once made her feel invincible. Her reflection looked foreign now. Not an agent, not a victim, something in between, someone who knew too much and had nowhere left to hide. The tension that had been building since that night had finally reached its breaking point. The lines between justice and revenge, right and wrong, truth and survival, had all blurred. And soon the world would see just how far one woman could be pushed before she broke. It was raining that night, the kind of cold, relentless rain that soaked through everything and made even the air feel heavy. The clock on Tasha's wall read 11:43 p.m. and she hadn't moved from her chair in hours. The house was dark except for the small lamp on her desk, casting a soft yellow glow over the open laptop and the scattered files surrounding it. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the last set of documents, evidence she'd gathered over weeks of sleepless nights. Names, transaction logs, email threads, enough to ruin careers, enough to make enemies. Outside, the sound of distant thunder rolled through the sky, followed by the hum of an engine. She froze. It was that same low, familiar sound, the dark sedan she'd been hearing for weeks. Slowly, she got up and peered through the blinds. The car was parked across the street again, engine idling, headlights dimmed. Her stomach turned cold. She reached for her phone, her fingers slick with sweat. But before she could dial, there was a sharp knock at the door, 3 quick hits, hard and deliberate. Her breath caught. No one knocked like that anymore. She hesitated, then the knock came again, louder. "Tasha," a voice called through the rain. "It's me, Rains." For a moment, she stood there, completely still. She hadn't seen him since their confrontation at the office a week ago. She had told him she never wanted to speak to him again. Now he was at her door in the middle of the night, while the car sat waiting outside like a shadow. She took a step closer to the door but didn't open it. "What do you want?" she called back. "I just want to talk," he said, his tone calm, almost tired. "Please, it's not safe for you right now, you need to listen." The word safe made her chest tighten. She thought of the envelope, the photos, the threats. Maybe he was telling the truth, or maybe this was how it ended. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door, but only halfway. Rain blew in with the wind, dampening her robe. Rain stood there under the porch light, water running down his face, his suit soaked through. He looked different, disheveled, almost desperate. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. She hesitated again, then stepped aside. "5 minutes," she said. "That's it." He nodded and stepped inside, leaving wet footprints across the floor. The room smelled of coffee and rain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Tasha," he began, his voice low. "Things have gone too far. They know what you're planning. You can't leak those files. You don't understand who you're up against." She crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "You mean you and your friends?" He shook his head. "It's bigger than me, bigger than Keller. You're poking at something that's been buried for years. People have disappeared for less." Her voice sharpened. "You helped bury it, didn't you?" Rains looked away. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," she snapped. The air between them thickened. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows like a warning. She stepped closer to him, her eyes fierce. "You came here to scare me, didn't you? To make sure I stay quiet." He sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "No, Tasha, I came here because they sent someone else. He's not here to scare you. He's here to end this." Her stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, the sound of gravel crunching outside made them both turn toward the window. Headlights flashed briefly before cutting out. The front gate creaked open. Rains reached inside his coat and pulled out his gun. "Get down," he whispered. Tasha's pulse exploded in her ears. She ducked behind the couch, reaching for her own weapon from the drawer by the desk. Her training kicked in, but her hands were shaking too much to steady her aim. The first shot shattered the front window. Glass rained across the floor. A second shot followed, hitting the doorframe. Rains crouched near the hallway, firing back through the broken glass. The smell of gunpowder filled the room. "Stay low," he shouted. Her breath came in short bursts. She crawled to the other side of the couch, her mind spinning. Who was out there? One of the corrupt agents? A hired hitman? The possibilities blurred together in the chaos. Another bullet tore through the living room wall, hitting a photo frame. It crashed to the floor beside her, the picture of her graduation day, her smile frozen in time. The sound jolted her, snapping something inside her chest. Rains ducked behind the table, firing again. "There are 2 of them," he yelled. "They're moving up the side." Tasha's grip tightened around her gun. "We can't stay here." "Back door," he shouted, gesturing toward the kitchen. She nodded and began to crawl, shards of glass cutting into her palms. The rain outside was deafening now, drowning out everything but the pounding of her heart. She reached the kitchen door just as another shot ripped through the wall behind her. Rains turned to cover her, but the next bullet caught him in the shoulder. He stumbled back, groaning, his gun falling from his hand. "Rains," she screamed. He pressed a hand to his wound, blood seeping through his fingers. "Go," he hissed. They're not here for me. Tasha hesitated, torn between instinct and fury. She couldn't leave him, but she couldn't die here either. She reached out, grabbed his arm, and pulled him toward the back door. They stumbled into the rain, slipping in the mud as bullets shattered the kitchen window behind them. The storm swallowed their footsteps as they ran toward the trees at the edge of her yard. "Keep moving," Rains gasped. The world around them was chaos, wind, water, gunfire. Her mind raced, replaying every decision that led here. The files, the threats, the betrayal, and now the final consequence. They reached the old shed near the fence line, ducking inside. Tasha's breath came in ragged bursts. She could hear footsteps approaching from the yard. Rains slumped against the wall, pale and trembling. "You should have let it go," he whispered. "And let them win," she shot back. He looked at her, eyes heavy with something like regret. "You don't get it, Tasha. No one wins, not in this game." Outside, the footsteps grew louder. She aimed her gun toward the doorway, her finger trembling on the trigger. Her vision blurred with rain and tears. For a brief second, she thought of everything she'd lost, her career, her trust, her peace. Then she thought of what she still had to lose. The shed door creaked open. A shadow appeared, gun raised. The shot rang out so loud it seemed to split the night in half. For a moment, everything stopped. The rain, the wind, even her heartbeat. Then came the smell of smoke and blood. When the light returned, Rains was on the ground, his body limp, eyes wide open. The shadow at the door staggered backward, clutching his chest. Tasha fired again, and again, until the figure collapsed outside in the mud. Silence followed, sharp, trembling silence. She dropped the gun, her hands slick and red. The sound of rain was all that filled the air now, steady and merciless. Her chest heaved as she stumbled out of the shed. The night was washed in blue flashes, distant sirens growing closer. Maybe a neighbor had called. Maybe someone had been watching the whole time. She fell to her knees beside Rains's body, her fingers brushing his sleeve. His blood was warm. His eyes stared at the ceiling as if trying to understand what had just happened. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I just wanted the truth." Somewhere behind her, a voice shouted, officers moving in. She could hear them shouting commands, their boots splashing through puddles, but she didn't move, she didn't even look up. Her gun lay beside her, half buried in the mud. By the time they reached her, the scene was already painted in tragedy. 2 bodies, 1 survivor, and a house filled with shattered glass and secrets. Tasha didn't resist when they pulled her to her feet. She didn't speak as they handcuffed her and led her toward the flashing lights. The rain washed the blood from her face, but it couldn't touch the look in her eyes, something between grief and clarity. Because in that moment, she finally understood what Rains meant. No one wins, not when truth comes at this kind of price. The night swallowed the rest, the sirens, the shouting, the questions. All that remained was the sound of rain hitting the roof of a house that would never feel like home again. The rain had stopped by morning, but the world still looked washed out and gray. Police tape fluttered weakly in the wind, wrapping around the broken fence and muddy ground where everything had come undone. The once quiet street buzzed with the low hum of engines and murmured voices. Reporters stood behind barricades, cameras pointed at the small brick house that now looked more like a crime scene than a home. The house where Agent Tasha Williams had killed 2 men, one a bureau officer, the other an unidentified assailant, in what officials were calling a disturbing and tragic event. Inside an interrogation room at the county precinct, Tasha sat in silence, her wrists cuffed to the table. Her clothes were still damp, her hair sticking to her face. The fluorescent light above her flickered occasionally, buzzing in the kind of way that made the room feel even smaller. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't said much of anything since they brought her in. Across the table, 2 detectives reviewed their notes. The younger one avoided her eyes, clearly uneasy. The older detective, a man with deep lines around his mouth, finally spoke. "Agent Williams," he said carefully, "we need you to start from the beginning. What happened last night?" Tasha looked at him for a long time before answering. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He leaned back in his chair. "Try me." She took a slow breath. "They came to kill me," she said softly. She paused, her voice catching. "Rains, he said someone sent them, said I knew too much." The detective scribbled something on his notepad. "You're saying this was a hit?" "Yes," she replied, "from inside the bureau." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, but her expression didn't change. It was the look of someone who had already accepted that the truth didn't matter anymore. Hours passed, questions blurred together, timelines, bullet trajectories, motives, all dissected and doubted. By the time the interview ended, she felt hollow. The official statement would later read that she acted in self-defense, but even that phrasing felt cruelly neat compared to the chaos of what really happened. The Bureau wasted no time in taking control of the narrative. By noon, national headlines had turned her into a spectacle. FBI agent involved in fatal shooting of fellow officer. News anchors debated whether she was a whistleblower or a murderer. Comment sections filled with strangers calling her unstable, reckless, and dangerous. The same people who once praised her as one of the Bureau's top field agents now tore her reputation apart. Her badge was suspended for 24 hours. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation, and she was placed under house arrest pending review. Cameras lined her street. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the road to avoid her. The world that had once respected her now stared at her like a stain they couldn't wash away. Tasha barely slept. When she did, she woke up gasping, hearing gunfire in her dreams. She saw Raines's eyes every time she closed hers, that look of regret frozen in his final seconds. She saw the shadow in the doorway, the faceless figure collapsing into the mud. She saw herself pulling the trigger. In the quiet hours before dawn, she would sit at her kitchen table, the same spot where everything began, and stare at the empty chair across from her. Sometimes she whispered his name. Sometimes she cursed it. Mostly she just sat there in silence, listening to the ticking of the clock and wondering when she'd stop feeling like a person. The Bureau issued a public statement calling the incident a tragedy under investigation. They didn't mention her whistleblower case. They didn't mention the files she had collected. They didn't mention that Raines had been sent to monitor her. Officially, it was a personal conflict gone wrong. Unofficially, everyone knew there was more to the story, but no one wanted to touch it. Her few remaining friends inside the Bureau tried reaching out, but they stopped after their messages started being monitored. One of them, an analyst named Mia, came by once late at night. She hugged Tasha tightly and whispered, "You were right about them. You always were." Then she left and never came back. The community had its own way of dealing with it. Some called her a hero for defending herself. Others said she was a disgrace who brought shame to the badge. Church groups held vigils for fallen law enforcement officers, and her name was never mentioned. But not everyone forgot. One journalist, the same one she'd been preparing to contact before the shooting, began digging deeper. He found inconsistencies in the Bureau's internal reports, sealed documents, and missing communication logs. Within weeks, whispers began spreading through the media that maybe Tasha Williams wasn't the villain after all. Yet for her, vindication meant nothing. She spent her days moving through the motions, answering questions from lawyers, attending hearings, facing cold stares from people who once trusted her. She didn't defend herself anymore. What was there to defend? 2 people were dead, one of them by her own hand, and the truth she'd tried to expose was still buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence. The psychological toll began to show. She stopped eating properly, barely spoke, and often sat by her window long after midnight, staring at the street where it all began. She started hearing phantom knocks at the door. Sometimes she thought she saw that same dark car again parked across the street. She would blink and it would be gone. Her mother visited once, sitting quietly beside her in the kitchen. "You did what you had to do," her mother said gently. Tasha didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the floor. "What if that's what they all say?" she whispered. "Every time someone pulls a trigger, what if we all just tell ourselves it had to be done?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "You're not them," she said softly. But Tasha wasn't sure she believed that anymore. The investigation dragged on for months. Evidence was reviewed, testimonies filed, reports rewritten to fit official narratives. In the end, the Department of Justice ruled her actions justifiable self-defense, closing the case without criminal charges. But even as she walked out of that courthouse a free woman, she knew she'd never really be free. Freedom, she realized, wasn't just about walking away from prison. It was about walking away from what you'd done, and she couldn't. The house where it all happened was eventually sold. No one wanted to buy it at first. People said they could still hear gunshots at night, that the walls whispered. When it finally sold, it went for half its worth. Tasha moved to a small apartment downtown. She kept to herself, avoided the news, and ignored the calls from producers asking for interviews. She didn't want fame or pity. She just wanted peace, though peace felt like something that didn't belong to her anymore. Months later, a story broke on national television. The journalist who had followed her case had uncovered leaked files confirming what Tasha had always claimed: a network of internal corruption involving agents, local police, and private contractors. Her name was cleared in the public eye almost overnight. But when reporters came knocking again, asking how it felt to be vindicated, she didn't answer. She didn't even open the door. Because it didn't matter anymore. The truth had cost her everything. At night, she sometimes dreamed of that first knock at 2 a.m., the sound of boots, the flash of light on the wall, the jacket that had once made her feel safe. And even though the rain had stopped long ago, she still woke up hearing it, pounding softly against the window, steady and cold, like a memory that refused to fade. In the end, the city moved on. New scandals took over the news cycle. People forgot her name. But in quiet corners of law enforcement circles, her story still lingered, a cautionary tale whispered about in training rooms and late-night bars. Some called her reckless, others called her brave, but the truth lay somewhere in between. She had been both and neither. She was simply a woman who tried to do the right thing in a world that punished her for it. And sometimes, that's the kind of crime that leaves the deepest scars of all. By the time the headlines faded and the reporters packed up their microphones, the story of Tasha Williams had already begun to turn into something else, less a breaking news scandal and more like a cautionary tale. People remembered fragments of it: the late-night shootout, the cover-up, the woman who stood her ground against corruption. But for those who lived through it, for Tasha, for the families of the dead, for the city that watched its faith in justice crumble, the wounds didn't close easily. When the official investigation ended, the Department of Justice cleared Tasha of all wrongdoing. Her actions were ruled as self-defense under extraordinary threat. The Bureau released a cold, calculated statement admitting to internal misconduct, but refused to name anyone responsible. A few lower officers were quietly reassigned, while others simply vanished from their posts. Those higher up, the ones who ordered the raid, who signed off on the false warrants, were untouched. The files leaked by the journalist confirmed everything Tasha had risked her life to prove: the money laundering, the falsified records, the dirty deals between agents and contractors. It was a rot that went deep into the system, but justice, when it came, felt weak, more like a gesture than a reckoning. For Tasha, justice was never about punishment, it was about truth, but even truth had a cost. She turned down every interview, every offer to tell her side. She was tired of sides. The Bureau had taught her that people didn't want the truth, they wanted something that fit their version of justice. So she stayed quiet, volunteering at a small legal aid center, helping people who didn't have power or lawyers or a voice. She no longer carried a gun, didn't keep one in her home. Her world became small, simple, deliberate. She preferred it that way. The families of those who died, Raines's wife, the unknown man's relatives, never contacted her. There were no apologies, no closure. Maybe they didn't need to be. Some wounds are meant to be remembered, not healed. When the truth broke, the public reaction was loud but brief. For a few weeks, her name trended online. Some called her a hero, others said she was dangerous, a rogue agent who embarrassed the Bureau. Politicians used her name in speeches. Her story became clickbait, campaign material, a headline that made people feel something for a moment before moving on to the next scandal. But the case left a quiet mark. People stopped believing so easily. The faith that citizens once placed in law enforcement cracked. Inside the Bureau, new recruits came with a different kind of attitude, cautious, skeptical, aware that loyalty didn't always mean honesty. New oversight committees were created and new rules for whistleblowers were introduced. On paper, it looked like a change. But Tasha knew how the system worked. It would heal itself just enough to survive. Universities started teaching her case. Professors called it an example of systemic failure. They said it showed how power protects itself and how truth-tellers often lose everything. They weren't wrong. What haunted people most wasn't the corruption or the violence. It was the realization that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to justice. Sometimes it only leads to isolation. For Tasha, survival became a quiet, lonely routine. She still saw the flashes from that night when she closed her eyes, the gunfire, the shouting, the heavy silence afterward. Even knowing she had no choice didn't ease the weight of it. Every action that night replayed like an echo she couldn't silence. Her therapist once told her that trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers until it changes who you are. That's what it did to her. The woman who once believed in saving the system now understood it was never built to be saved. It was built to protect itself. The files that exposed everything sat in a locked drawer in her home. Sometimes she'd take them out, trace her fingers along the papers, and remember the person she used to be, the one who thought truth could fix things. The case, later named the Miller Farmhouse Incident by the press, became a mirror reflecting everything wrong with the country's justice system. It forced people to ask hard questions. How many truths are buried because they're inconvenient? How many so-called heroes are built on silence and lies? It wasn't just about one night or one woman. It was about the cracks in the foundation everyone had been told to trust. Politicians promised reform. The Bureau made statements about accountability. But beneath all the noise, people knew the truth: real change doesn't come from institutions. It comes from individuals willing to stand alone. That was Tasha's true legacy. She didn't fix the system, but she exposed it. She made people see that justice isn't a law, it's a choice, and it comes with a price. At its heart, this wasn't a story about crime or revenge. It was about what power does to people, about how even good men like Raines can twist themselves into villains when loyalty becomes blind, about how morality bends when survival is on the line. Everyone involved believed they were right. Raines thought he was protecting the Bureau. The men who stormed her house believed they were enforcing order. The officials who buried the truth told themselves they were preserving stability. None of them thought they were the villains, and that's what made it terrifying. Tasha's final act, pulling the trigger, exposing the files, walking away, wasn't heroic. It wasn't even clean. It was human. It came from fear, pain, and conviction all at once. That's what makes her story so haunting. It's not about good versus evil. It's about people trying to survive in a world where truth is dangerous. Years later, a journalist wrote a book called The Woman Who Fought the System and Lost. But they missed the point. Tasha didn't lose. She learned that victory doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like scars and silence. It looks like surviving when the system wants you gone. Her story became a quiet reminder that justice is fragile, morality is slippery, and truth often demands more than people are willing to give. She showed that sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge or a uniform. Sometimes it sits alone in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to drag it into the light. In the end, Tasha Williams wasn't a saint or a sinner. She was something more real, a mirror. A reflection of a system built on fear, a society built on denial, and a woman who refused to look away. And even if the world forgets her name, the echo of her choices will linger, proof that one act of truth can still shake everything built on lies.